Yo, what's good, Spirit Squad? And welcome to, I guess, Tier List Tuesday. Today, we're going to be taking a look at Pioneer, and we're not going to be taking a look at the Pioneer decks just based on strength like I would usually do. Today, we're going to take a look at the Pioneer decks, or at least the most popular of them. And we're going to figure out exactly which ones are easiest to get into versus which decks are maybe not so easy to get into. We'll go over a quick summary of what the decks look like, and we'll put them in a nice order for you. Hope you'll enjoy. To determine how easy a deck is to actually get into, we're going to work with three criteria today. The first of which is going to be the price. How expensive is the deck to actually buy? The second criteria is going to be how easy is the deck to play? Is it going to be point and click, or do you need to read 3 books and maybe have a degree in the deck to actually pilot it? The third is going to be how often does the deck actually win? So that's going to be our criteria for determining whether a deck is going to be S tier as far as getting into it, or all the way down in D. For our tiers themselves, we've got a couple of cool little names to help go with them. S is going to be for super easy to get into, and that's going to be if a deck is really cheap to buy and really easy to play and does a lot of winning. A is going to be an acceptably easy deck. Maybe the deck is cheap and good, but not easy to play, or any 2 out of the 3 categories, right? B is going to be for borderline. This deck is totally acceptable, but you might have to put some work into it. C, choices are being made here. Might not recommend, but if you really like it, go for it. Honestly, that's going to be true of every deck, but you get the idea. And D is going to be for don't buy this, probably. Well, that's going to be my advice. If I put a deck all the way down for D tier, you probably don't buy it. Below, we've got a few infographics to represent each of the popular Pioneer decks that are being played right now. For example, Arclight Phoenix is going to be represented by, well, Arclight Phoenix. Ascendant Spirit is going to be the highlight card for Mono Blue Spirits. So on and so forth until we come across all of the really popular decks being played in Pioneer. We're going to go ahead and just kind of get everything here in alphabetical order as we already have the cards pulled, and then we'll talk about each one of them. So first up on the chopping block is going to be the Is It Phoenix deck, represented by Arclight Phoenix itself. So on our 3 categories here, I actually think Arclight Phoenix does pretty well for our first deck that we're going over. As far as the price, Arclight Phoenix is neither super expensive or super cheap in either paper or Magic Online. In paper, the deck is going to be somewhere between $420 and $450 American anyway, to get the entire thing. And that's about middle of the road. As far as Magic Online, it's only going to be somewhere between 220 and 250 tickets, making it on the much more acceptable end of decks. That might even be on a cheaper end, actually. So I'm going to put Arclight Phoenix's price right around B. As far as ease of play, I think the Phoenix deck is also going to be right around a B. The reason for that is that you do have some lines that are just point and click. You put some Arclight Phoenixes in the graveyard, you reanimate them by casting 3 spells in the same turn before combat, you attack, life is very easy. However, you also have an opponent. Sometimes they'll just go ahead and interact with you, and you're going to be stuck navigating through a bunch of hate cards. Maybe your opponent's a little faster than you are, and you're stuck playing removal, and then you have to navigate how to actually get 3 spells in the same turn without dying. You know, it's not always playing solitaire. And for that reason, I'm going to put it also right around a B as far as ease of play. Where I think the Phoenix deck shines is going to be its win rate. And right now it is not the best deck in the format, but it's definitely good, and it does a decent amount of winning. I'm going to put Phoenix in the A tier as far as its actual win rate. So when you average out a B, and an A, I'm going to put it right towards the top of the B tier. A pretty good showing for our first deck. So next up on our tier list is going to be one of my personal favorites, and that's going to be Mono Blue Spirits. And this of course is a deck that's near and dear to my heart. As far as the price of the deck, Mono Blue Spirits is easily the best deck in the entire format as far as price. To get the entire deck, including multiple Brazen Bowers, is going to be like $110 to $130 American. That is dirt cheap, and Brazen Bowers make up a huge chunk of that at about $15 a piece. If you don't want to play any Brazen Bowers, that'll save you somewhere between $15 and $45 on the price. In Magic Online, it's going to be a little more expensive because of how expensive Brazen Borrowers are, about 40 ticks a piece. But even if you play 3 copies of Brazen Borrower, that's still only going to be between 160 and 190 tickets. Less than 200 tickets for a competitive deck is very, very cheap. Easily the top of S tier as far as price. As far as actually playing the deck, ease of play, that's where Spirits is going to fail a little bit. You will have some games where you just get to go 1 drop, put a Curious Obsession on that 1 drop, protect it with a counter spell, ride back to victory. Those games are absurdly easy. However, that's not realistic for most of your games. There's going to be a lot of very cheap creature removal in the format. There's also going to be opponents doing things that you can't necessarily counterspell, like cycling Shark Typhoons or playing Supreme Verdict. Those games get a lot harder and you will have to navigate through removal and hate spells. So for that reason, I'm actually going to put Spirits all the way at C tier as far as ease of play. And the other area where Spirits really shines is going to be the win rate. Despite the low number of people actually playing Spirits, Spirits does an absurd amount of winning. In the past couple of weeks, Mono Blue Spirits has won a Pioneer Challenge, it's won the Pioneer Showcase Challenge, the most recent one, and there's a whole slew of first place finishes in smaller tournaments around the world. So for win rate, I would also put Spirits at the S tier, but probably towards the bottom of S tier because of how few people are playing it. However, the price is an S, the win rate is an S, and even if the ease of play is a C, you'll still get some very easy games. For that reason, I'm going to put Mono Blue Spirits in the S tier for how easy the deck is to get into, but I will accept that by the end of this tier list, it might be at the bottom of S tier. The next deck we're going to talk about is going to be Mono Red Aggro, and that's going to be represented by our friend Eidolon the Great Revel. And Mono Red Aggro is honestly about middle of the pack as far as decks that are easy or not easy to get into. As far as the price, this is probably going to be the one that surprises the most people. For a deck that's only playing 1 color, Mono Red is really expensive in both paper and Magic Online. And as far as paper, the price is going to be something like $320, $330 American, and on Magic Online, that number goes even higher to roughly 375 tickets. The reason for that, in paper, is that Eidolon the Great Revel by itself is pretty expensive. They're about $100 for a playset. And in Magic Online, the real culprit here is going to be Den of the Bugbear, which this deck plays 4 of. And that runs about 150 tickets for a playset of those. This deck is not very cheap. And as far as price, I'm going to put it all the way down in C tier. The area where it shines the most is going to be ease of play, and I think Mono Red is going to be a solid S as far as how easy the deck is to actually play. Granted, you do have an opponent and you have a lot of hate cards to deal with, but the deck is still relatively point and click. You play some creatures, you attack them, you burn them, they get dead. That's the plan. And as far as the win rate goes, Mono Red Aggro is going to be right around the middle of the pack, in B tier. It has top 8'd a couple of challenges recently, but it hasn't actually won any events, and you do see a few 5-0 finishes every now and then, right around middle of the road. When you average all of those, I'm going to put Mono Red Aggro right in the A tier, but I do accept that later on in the tier list, it might be on the lower end of A tier. Overall, still really easy to get into. Next up on our tier list is going to be the various Fires of Invention builds, and as far as Fires goes, I've been able to find 2 builds that have actually been seeing play. One is going to be an Enchantress build that focuses around Jukai Naturalist. The other is going to be a more traditional Agent of Treachery build that's looking to cheat that into play and take your opponent's stuff. As far as prices go, these decks are going to be around the same IRL. Unfortunately, that means that these decks kind of fail that test. These are very expensive decks, and I would put them around D tier as far as pricing. I wasn't able to find a single Fires of Invention list for less than $500 American. That's like 3 Mono Blue Spirits decks. As far as Magic Online goes though, that's very different. The Agent of Treachery lists, those are still pretty expensive, right around 400 ticks, but the Jukai Naturalist build is really cheap, right around 110 to 120 tickets. So if you are looking to get into a Fires of Invention deck on the cheap, then Magic Online with the Enchantress build is probably your way to go. But I'm going to focus a little more on IRL, so I'm going to put this deck all the way down in D tier as far as price. As far as ease of play, both of them are relatively point and click, but they are also slow decks that are trying to resolve one big spell, and that kind of causes a problem for Fires of Invention decks. A lot of decks, even the ones that we've already talked about, are either very fast, they're playing counter spells to work around your key spells, or both. In the example of Mono Blue Spirits, you have a very fast clock backed up by a lot of counter spells, so when do you ever have time to resolve a Fires of Invention? Against a deck like Mono Red, good luck having time to take 4 mana off. And unfortunately, you have to navigate those games, and that's going to put it as C as far as ease of play. As far as win rate, the reasons I gave for ease of play unfortunately led to a not very good win rate for Fires of Invention either. I had to go all the way back to middle of April. We're at the end of May now. I had to go back to the middle of April to find a single Pioneer Challenge top 8 for a Fires of Invention deck. And there were a few 5-0 trophies here and there, but by a few, I mean like 2. Unfortunately, that means that Fires of Invention is going to go all the way down to a D as far as win rate too. And that means that I don't, in good conscience, think I can recommend this deck to anybody. I'm going to put Fires of Invention as our first D tier deck. Next up on our tier list is going to be Bant or Selesnya Angels, and that's going to be represented by Giada Font of Hope. Honestly, the only difference between the Bant and the Selesnya versions of the deck are whether they are playing Linvala Shield of Seagate. But either way, the deck does exactly one thing. You play a bunch of flyers, you beat up on decks like Spirits and Mono Red Aggro, and you collect your Ws. Here, the first category is going to be for price, and that's going to be the Angel deck's biggest failure. The Angel deck is expensive. The cheapest version of this deck I was able to find online is $550 American. And if you're playing Bant, this can go as high as $700. If you're comparing it to the other flying deck, of course Mono Blue Spirits, that's anywhere between 4 and like 6 entire Spirits decks. This thing is really expensive. However, as far as ease of play goes, Bant Angels might be one of the easiest S's in the entire format. You just do one thing. You play creatures, you gain life, you collect your W. That's basically the entire Angels plan. Collect the Company makes that even easier. The win rate is where this one kind of falls middle of the pack. We have seen one modern, I'm gonna keep doing that. We've seen one Pioneer Challenge top 8 recently, and a couple of trophies here and there, but honestly, nothing stellar. Put it right around the middle of the pack, so tier B as far as win rate goes. And I'm gonna average all of those things out to having Angels be our first C tier deck as far as ease of getting into. Next up on our tier list here is going to be Mono Black Devotion, and if I'm being completely honest, that is not a deck I expected to see on this list. When I was going over the Pioneer decks, I saw Grey Merchant, and I was like, really? Grey Merchant? That's seeing play right now? I haven't seen it in forever, but here it is. And this deck is honestly only being piloted by a few people, or at least a few people to good result, but that made it popular enough to show up in the top 20 most popular decks in Pioneer, so color me surprised, I guess. Anyway, as far as the price of this deck goes, IRL, it's actually really expensive, and there's 2 reasons for that. First, this deck plays the Meathook Massacre, 3 of those in the main, and anybody who plays Standard will know that card is wicked expensive in paper. Just 3 copies of that card is almost $200. And the other culprit here is going to be Nykthos Shrine of Nyx. And that deck plays 4 copies of that, but that card is also in the Mono Green Devotion deck, which is doing very well right now. So that card is at least understandably very expensive, at about $150 for a playset. So This deck is not very cheap, it's almost $600 in paper, and that's going to put it all the way in D tier as far as price. As far as the ease of play goes, Mono Black Devotion is on the much easier side, and I would actually put it all the way up in A tier as far as ease of play. You just remove some of your opponent's stuff, you play your own stuff, you get some pips on the board, and you turn those pips into a profitable Grey Merchant of Asphodel. That's basically how you're going to end up winning most of your games. And as far as the win rate goes, this one's going to be another D. Now, again, a couple of people have been playing this deck, and I've seen a couple of 5-0s here and there on the trophy list. And we've also seen some top 32 results in the Pioneer challenges. But to be honest, top 32s aren't necessarily impressive. So I'm going to put this one all the way down in D as far as win rate as well. And even though the deck is an A as far as ease of play, spending almost $600 for a deck that's not doing that much winning adds up to a deck that I don't necessarily think that I would recommend to everybody. And I'm going to put Mono Black Devotion as our second D tier deck. So our next deck is going to be Greasefang combo, and Greasefang does one thing, but honestly it does it really well. You put things down like Parhelion, you pick them up with Greasefang, and together your weightlifting combo gives you giant vehicles and giant attacks. Pretty sweet stuff. As far as the price, that's going to be where I think Greasefang falls right into the C tier. It's not the most expensive deck out there, but it is pretty expensive, especially since both the Esper and the Mardu variants have 3-color mana bases, of course. These decks are going to range right around, what, $500 to $550 each. If you're playing on Magic Online, they're going to be a little closer to the $300 to $400 ticket range, depending on which version of the deck you're playing. So, C tier it is for price. As far as ease of play, I think that's going to be where Greasefang decks do the best, and I'm going to put those in the A tier. At the base, you're looking to just do exactly one thing. You put giant vehicles in the graveyard, you pick them up with Greasefang, life is very easy, you get off huge attacks. However, this is a known deck, and there's going to be a lot of hate cards for this as a direct result. People know how to kill Greasefang in the main phase, people know how to pack graveyard hate that is not Grafdigger's Cage, to make sure that your things stay out of the graveyard. And you're still going to have to navigate those and be able to win games. So as far as ease of play, I wouldn't put it into the S tier because even though you have one plan, it's still very easy to hate out. But I will put it into A tier because the deck is still at its core pretty easy to play. And as far as win rate goes, a few weeks ago, we actually saw one weekend in which the Greasefang deck both won and top 4'd Pioneer challenges on different days, so great stuff there. However, that's a couple of weeks ago. Now, the deck still has some 5-0 trophy finishes, but is otherwise middle of the pack, so I'm going to put it into the B tier as far as win rate. However, all of that combined means that if you can afford the deck, it's still pretty easy to get into. So I'm going to put this towards the bottom of A tier as far as ease of getting into. Good job, Greasefang. Next, we're going to talk about Boros Heroic, a deck that keeps coming back into the Pioneer format every single time it so much as sniffs at a new toy. The new toy out of Streets of New Capenna is going to be Illuminator Virtuoso, and it's proven to be a pretty big W for the deck. As far as the price of this deck goes, it's going to be one of the best in the entire tier. We've got about $200 to about $220 American for the entire deck IRL. But on Magic Online is where the price really shines. The entire deck, including the mana base, is under $70 American. That's half the price of Mono Blue Spirits. Probably going to be the cheapest deck that we see in the entire format by a mile. As far as the ease of play goes, Heroic falls off just a little bit, but is still A tier as far as how easy it is to play. At its core, you're just playing an aggressive deck with a bunch of spells to protect and grow them. And that's going to be a pretty good plan. You're playing cards like Soulscar Mage, Monastery Swiftspear, and Favorite Hoplite to make a really good aggressive core, and that by itself is just going to end some games. However, your opponents are also going to be playing a lot of removal cards. Your job is going to be to play the spells that are in your deck designed to protect those cards, and that's where it can get a little bit dicey, but still pretty easy overall. As far as the win rate, that's where this deck is really shining right now. Just last week, the deck got 2 copies of the deck in the top 8 of a Pioneer Challenge, and then it won another one. This deck is easily an S tier as far as win rate. And that means, as far as getting into the deck, definitely S tier overall. This deck is even easier to get into than Mono Blue Spirits, so I'm going to put it currently at the top of S tier. Heroic deck is really good right now. Now we're going to talk about Rakdos Midrange, represented by Krox the Titan of Death's Hunger. And this is going to be your mid-range deck of the format. A little discard, a little removal, some good threats, and you have a deck. Honestly, a pretty good formula for success, and that is shown lately. As far as the price though, this deck is on the expensive side. It's not anywhere near as expensive as decks like Angels, but sitting at right around $500 American, it's still nowhere near cheap. I'm going to put that in the C tier as far as price goes. As far as the ease of play, well, it's a little bit better there. Realistically, your only plan is going to be to point and click and deal with what your opponent is doing, be it cards in their hand or creatures on the battlefield, play some threats of your own, and end the game. That's really what you're looking to do. Your job is just to figure out which thing is best for solving which problem. And as far as the win rate goes, that's going to be another place where this deck shines. It just won a Pioneer Challenge last week, which is sweet. And there's a few 5-0 finishes in the last couple of weeks as well. Overall, great stuff for Rakdos. However, most pilots are not doing that well. There are a few like top 16 and top 32 challenge finishes, and that's okay, but nothing stellar other than last week's win, which was great. And for that, I'm going to put it into the A tier as far as win rate. However, the price is really holding it back. It is not a cheap deck to get into. So I'm going to put Rakdos Midrange in the B tier overall as far as ease of actually getting into the deck. Now we're going to have the coolest new kid on the block, and that's going to be Blue-Red Prowess. Now, decks with expressive iteration are not new to Pioneer at all. We just talked about Is It Phoenix earlier. But this version of the deck is something that's come and gone in the format a few times, but now that Ledger Shredder is a card that exists, Blue-Red Prowess has been very, very good all over the format, and for a good reason. The price is not one of those reasons. Right around $400-ish American, the deck's relatively expensive, but nowhere near the most egregious. I'm going to put this in the C tier as far as price goes. As far as the ease of play, the deck is relatively easy to play. You play some cheap threats like Monastery Swiftspear and Soulscar Mage, you get Ledger Shredder and Sprite Dragon at the 2 drops, and then you just stop paying a lot of mana for stuff. Everything else costs 1 or 2, including up to 4 full copies of Treasure Cruise, and oh boy, that card is busted. So I'm going to put this deck into A tier as far as ease of play, because your base plan is very simple. Play some creatures, attack, play some undercosted spells, attack more. Your opponent eventually gets dead. And as far as win rate, that's where this deck really shines. Prowess is great right now. Just this weekend alone, there have been 3 top 8s in the Pioneer Challenges, and a whole slew of 5-0 finishes in the leagues. This deck is real, and I'm definitely putting into the S tier as far as win rate. Overall, the price is honestly the only thing that's really holding it back. If you can afford this deck, I totally suggest buying it. I'm going to put this deck all the way into the A tier as far as ease of getting into, and I'm going to put it at the top of A tier above even Mono Red Aggro. This deck is great. So next up, we're going to talk about the Orzhov, or sometimes Azorius. Either way, they're going to be white-based Aurus decks. And the Aurus decks are going to have a lot of Sarams and Lightpaw's Emperor's Voices, Auras, and you generally get to swing for a crap ton. Honestly, the deck's pretty sweet. However, it's fallen out of favor. But I still think the deck's really easy to get into if you're willing to take the time to master it. As far as the price is concerned, on Magic Online, this deck is dirt cheap, usually less than 100 tickets for any version of the deck. In paper, the Orzhov version is fairly cheap most of the time, at or even under $200 total. The Azorius version, because the blue-white lands are a little more expensive, that one can run you over 200 tickets, but usually not more than dollars, but not more than 300. Either way, deck's pretty cheap, and because of the online considerations, I'm going to put it into S tier as far as price. As far as ease of play goes, this one is going to be another very easy S. You just play some creatures, you put some auras on them, and you swing for a lot. That is your goal. Your job is to dodge a little bit of removal here and there along the way, but you have cards like Karametra's Blessing already in the deck to help you out with that. And you're usually going to be gaining a lot of life along the way too. This deck is overall really easy to play. Another S. As far as the win rate, that's where this deck starts to fall off, because the deck, when Light Paws first came out, was really popular, did pretty well, top 8'd a couple of challenges here and there, and unfortunately now it's kind of fallen off as far as win rate goes. It's really tough right now to untap with a 1 or 2 toughness creature, and that's kind of this deck's entire function. So unfortunately for win rate, I'm going to slap this all the way down into D tier. Just, you know, it's outlived its usefulness, I guess. But if you're willing to take the time, it is very powerful, as long as you can untap with a creature. And all of those together, I'm going to put this deck at the very top of B tier for ease of getting into, because the deck is cheap and it's easy to play, but you might get frustrated trying to get good with it. Next up is going to be the premier combo deck of the format, and that's going to be Lotus Field combo. So Lotus Field is a deck that always gets really respected or not at all respected in Pioneer, and it shares a bit of a unique spot within the metagame right now. I personally think it's really cool, even if I don't personally like playing the deck. Anyway, as far as price is concerned, there's 2 ways to go about this, and I can put it either in S tier because there is a challenger version of the deck that Wizards of the Coast sells, and it is playable and good right out of the box. Or you can go all out and play cards like Boseiju Who Endures, and you can make your deck fully teched out. If you do decide to play up to 3 copies of Boseiju, the price of the deck goes up to about $300 to $350 American in paper and about $200 online. However, if you decide to play without Boseiju, which is easily the most expensive card in this deck, the price for the Magic Online version of the deck goes down under 100 tickets and roughly $120 American, so it's pretty cheap without Boseiju. Really, balls in your court there. I am going to go ahead and average that out to being about B tier as far as price is concerned. Maybe even A tier. A tier it is. As far as ease of play is concerned, I think the deck is good, but I don't think it is easy to play. There's a lot of hate for it, it is a known quantity, and your job is going to be to navigate through all of the counter spells, damping spheres, deafening silences, and other forms of hate that come across this deck. So I'm going to put it all the way down into D tier for ease of play. However, the win rate is where this deck really shines. If you put the work into getting good at this deck, it will reward you. It's got a few 5-0 finishes here and there, but in just this last weekend, it put 2 people in top 8 of Pioneer challenges, and it won another one. This deck needs to be respected. Overall, I'm going to say that actually puts this deck at the top of B tier as far as getting into it. There is a learning curve, but you can buy it on the cheap and it rewards you for the work you put in. Overall, a great choice. And now we've got the various sacrifice archetypes, and these are going to be represented by Mayhem Devil. So these decks are honestly pretty point and click. You just have to do a lot of pointing and a lot of clicking. You get to play your Mayhem Devil or Cauldron Familiar or Corvold, and you get to take advantage of sacrificing things to great benefit. That's the idea behind these decks. And well, they're actually pretty cool as far as decks are concerned. I've played them, they're fun, I will probably play them again. As far as the price though, that is definitely going to be the biggest downfall of the sacrifice decks. There's 2 primary versions of the deck, Rakdos and Jund, and the Rakdos version of the deck usually costs right around $550 to about $580 American. A lot of this is going to be because of the Meat Hook Massacre, but honestly the rest of the deck isn't cheap either. The Jund version plays a whole 3rd color, sometimes including Boseiju and up to 4 copies of the Meat Hook Massacre, making the total of that deck closer to $750 American. This thing is super expensive, and honestly it's about as expensive as like some modern decks. That's a lot of money. As far as the ease of play goes, that's going to be where these sacrifice decks really shine. Like I said, there is a lot of pointing and clicking, but honestly that's really kind of it. You're just looking to sacrifice things, get advantages from them, and ride those advantages to victory. Overall, a relatively easy game plan. And as far as the win rate goes for this deck, it's about middle of the road. There are quite a few 5-0 trophy finishes with versions of these decks. However, no one's top 8'd a challenge with this deck recently. There have been a couple of people who've gotten close here and there, but so far, no recent successes. If you're listening to this, good luck and hope you make it. Overall, I'm going to put the sacrifice decks right around the top of the C tier for getting into, because it is easy to learn and easy to play, but that price really holds it back. And one of the coolest decks in my opinion on this list is going to be Izzet Control, and that's going to be represented by MTG Pioneer. Izzet Control is a deck that is really been in favor and has fallen a little bit out of favor, but still has some definite fans, and it shows. As far as the price for this deck goes, it's relatively expensive in paper, coming in at almost $500 American. Online it's a lot cheaper, somewhere between 250 and 275 tickets. So that's a lot more affordable. So for the price, I'm going to put it right around C tier. As far as the ease of play goes, I do think Izzet Control is relatively easy to play. You have a few threats of your own that you're looking to ride to victory, like Niv Mizzet and Thing in the Ice. You deal with whatever your opponent's doing with a bunch of removal spells, and you have some card advantage along the way, like Expressive Iteration, one of the best cards in honestly all of Magic the Gathering. As far as actually playing the deck though, it's kind of point and click. As far as the win rate goes, that's where I think it's kind of middle of the pack. This used to be one of the best decks in the format a month and a half ago, but since we've had exactly one Pioneer Challenge top 8 recently, and a few 5-0 finishes here and there, but nothing stellar. Overall, about a B as far as win rate goes. And overall, that's probably where I would put this deck, about B tier. It's relatively easy to play if you can afford it. I would put it right below Phoenix and above Rakdos midrange. So next is going to be one of the coolest decks in the entire format, and that's going to be Niv to Light, the 5-color control deck. And it just does a little bit of everything, except be cheap. As far as the price goes, it's about $500-ish American to buy the entire deck. Online, you get a lot more of a break. It's a little under 200 tickets there. So if you want to build this deck and you're choosing between IRL and paper, IRL and Moto, I think I would choose Magic Online. And for that, I'm going to balance it out to being about C tier because like I said, I do want to give more weight to the IRL prices, but I'll give some consideration to the pretty cheap online price. As far as the ease of play goes, I think this deck actually just kind of chills around a B. There's going to be a lot of places where your opponent plays a creature, you have a removal in your hand for it, congrats, the creature's dead, and then you get to play your very powerful cards. However, sometimes your removal just doesn't line up with the scenario, or your removal costs a little too much for what your opponent is presenting as far as problems go, and you can kind of get run over by a very fast clock or a couple of timely counter spells. And your job is going to be to learn how to navigate those games. And as far as win rate, I think that's where this deck really falls off, because honestly, there is one main pilot who is an absolute monster with this deck, Claudio. Claudio just won a Pioneer Challenge a couple of weeks ago, and I think he also top 8'd another one this same weekend. He's also sometimes the trophy leader in the entire world with this deck. Dude's a monster. Getting everybody else to win with this deck though, it's kind of a challenge. Like, there's some 5-0s here and there, but overall it's really just him carrying it. And until other people start playing this deck and winning, I'm gonna stick it into C tier as far as win rate. It's an S if he's playing it though. However, I'm gonna balance all of those things out to Niv to Light being a C tier deck as far as ease of getting into. I think it's gonna be a little easier than Angels because it's still like $200, $300 cheaper, but overall, C it is. So next is going to be another sweet tribal deck, and that's going to be the Team Edward deck, Vampires. And despite the goofy name, the deck is pretty cool. There's two main versions of it. There's going to be Black-White, which gets to play just like Legion Lieutenant and a couple of different versions of Sorin, namely the 3-drop Sorin Imperious Bloodlord, and that's going to be easily the best card in this entire deck for all versions. And there's going to be Grixis, which looks to play Sorin, resolve it, and get it to gate in a really cheap Lord Xander the Collector, and both versions of the deck are pretty cool otherwise. They have a great mono red matchup, and not many other great matchups unfortunately right now. And the downside to playing this deck is that the Grixis version of it, the most popular one, is ridiculously expensive. It's like $750 American. On Moto, it's a lot cheaper, chilling around a 300 ticket range, but even that's pretty expensive for a niche deck. As far as ease of play goes, I think that's where this deck shines the brightest. It is ridiculously easy to play. You play some vampires, you have a couple of disruption spells like Thoughtseize, Fatal Push, Dreadbore, stuff like that. You resolve a Sorin, and you let Sorin just kind of carry you through the entire game. That's pretty much what the deal is. You deal with their stuff, you resolve Sorin, you attack them dead. You do have some other creatures, but Sorin's really the thing to go to. And the win rate is another place where I think this deck kind of falls off sharply. There have been a couple of 5-0s here and there, but that's really it, just a couple of 5-0s here and there. Nothing really spectacular, no challenge top finishes in the last few weeks, and as cool as this deck is, I don't really know that I would recommend it to anybody. I would actually put it all the way down in D tier, even below the mono black devotion deck because of how expensive this thing is. If you already have the cards, by all means go for it, but I don't think I would recommend spending almost $1,000 on this deck. So our next deck is going to be one of my personal favorites, of course, and that's going to be Bant Spirits. Bant Spirits IRL, the pricing is pretty expensive, especially when you compare it to another deck like Mono Blue. To get Bant Spirits in paper, you're looking at somewhere between $450 and $500 American, so it's pretty expensive in the C tier. However, I'll give a little consideration to the online pricing. If you want to get Bant Spirits on Magic the Gathering Online, the entire deck is less than 200 tickets there. So if you want to play Bant Spirits, I'd probably suggest going online, but it's still going to be a C as far as pricing is concerned. The other two fields, for both win rate and playability, are going to rank right into the B tier. At its core, Spirits is pretty easy to play. You play some creatures, you kill your opponent dead, and you try to disrupt what they're doing just a little bit along the way. Bant has a much easier time of that than Mono Blue because Bant is just a more aggressive, more powerful deck that's looking to play more Lord effects like Empyrean Eagle when you compare it to another deck like Mono Blue that's just playing Supreme Phantoms. So Bant honestly is a lot easier to play than Mono Blue. Of course, it gets a B and not an A or an S because there's a lot more removal and you're playing a lot fewer protection spells. So your creatures, while more powerful, are also going to be a bit more vulnerable to your opponent's spells and removals. So you kinda gotta navigate that sweet point. And then win rate is also going to be a B. Now, a couple of weeks ago, we did see frequent user REMF just top 8 a challenge, and I think they actually just got second place a couple of weeks ago, so that's pretty sweet. And we did see one top 8 recently other than that. And then a few 5-0s here and there, but on the whole, nothing super impressive outside of those few top finishes. So I would also put it in the B as far as win rate. But when you average out a couple of Bs and a C, I'm thinking you're looking right around the middle of B, so I would put it just under Phoenix. Yeah, I think that's about right for Bant Spirits. Alright, so next up on our list is going to be Mono Green Devotion, represented by Storm the Festival. And Mono Green is one of the coolest new decks to come out. So the idea is that you just play a bunch of green devotion things like Mana Elves, Wolf Willowhaven, etc. and you use Nykthos Shrine of Nyx to make honestly absurd amounts of mana. And the best part about it is that you're playing Kiora Behemoth Beckoner, which can untap any of your cards up to and including a Nykthos. So this deck goes from 1 to 3 to like 100 mana really easily. And the results reflect that. As far as price, I would put Mono Green Devotion solidly into C tier. The deck is pretty expensive, mostly because, well, Nykthos is expensive. It's like $150 for a playset, with making the entire deck sitting just around $500 American. If you want to get it on Moto instead of IRL, the price dips down to about $300, but honestly for a Pioneer deck that's still kind of expensive online. So C tier it is. The ease of play is where this deck really shines. it's a solid S. The deck is basically point and click. How much mana can I make? If you can count, you can play this deck. And it's really, really cool to know that, right? Because a lot of your decisions really are just, what's the biggest card I can play? Cool, play the biggest card. Occasionally you'll have to do something outside of your most preferred line, like if you're playing against spirits, for example, you a lot of the times will play Cavalier Thorns instead of Storm the Festival, but that's really it. The deck's an S as far as playability. And then win rate is another area where Mono Green Devotion really shines. I would actually put it in A tier. It's got a top 8 in each of this week's and last week's Pioneer challenges, and a few 5-0s here and there. It used to be, a few weeks ago, one of the absolute best decks in all of Pioneer, but now it's still pretty good, even if it's fallen off of the top spot a little bit. But if you average out a C, an S, and an A, I'm gonna put that all the way at the bottom of A. The price does hold it back a little bit. Nykthos is really expensive and doesn't go in any other decks, but if you can afford this deck, I think it's definitely worth your time. It's both good and easy to play. So next up, we've got the fun police of the format, and that's going to be Blue-White Control. Now, Blue-White Control has done the exact same thing for the last, 20 years, which is really just counter your opponent's important spells, remove their creatures, resolve a big giant threat of your own, and let it carry the game for you. In this case, the threats are going to be Teferi, Hero of Dominaria, which is our representative here, and the Wandering Emperor. We've got a couple of things along the way, which is kind of pilot dependent, right? Like you can play Dream Trawler, you can play Shark Typhoon, you can even play Hullbreaker Horror if you really feel like it. There's a lot of options for Blue-White Control. Getting the deck cheaply is not one of those options. This is going to be one of our most D-tier decks as far as price is concerned, coming in at almost $700 American if you want to buy the deck in paper. If you want to get the deck online, it is a little cheaper, but by a little cheaper, I'm still talking about 500-ish tickets. This deck is not cheap at all. The upside to this deck, though, is that it's not the easiest to play, but it's still relatively easy. I would put it in the B to C tier, bordering on C. The reason that I think it's a little hard to play, even though your decisions are mostly, what is my opponent doing? Do I care? If I care, then solve it. If not, then draw cards and then solve it later. That's usually the decision tree, but making those decisions requires you to know the entire format. And when you need to know an entire format worth of cards just to play your deck, that does up the difficulty quite a bit when you're playing any deck, let alone a control deck. The win rate is where this deck really shines. We just had a top 8 from Blue-White Control in each of this weekend's Pioneer challenges, so the deck's doing really well. And it's got a few 5-0s here and there, but other than the spot couple of finishes and a couple of trophies here and there, it's not going absolutely crazy, so I can't put it in S tier, but it's definitely A tier as far as win rate goes. When I say I would pick up Blue-White Control, I would definitely recommend it. But that's a big if because it's about $700. So if you can afford it, it is a great deck to play, but affording it is a pretty big ask. So I'm going to put it into C tier as far as ease of picking up the deck, because honestly, $700 is a lot of money to divest into one deck if you're not even necessarily sure you really want to be playing it. But if you know you want to be playing it, Blue-White is great. And our last deck of the day is going to be Naya Winota. And Winota is easily the boogie woman of the format. She's very strong, very powerful, and just resolving her usually means game over against a lot of decks. The only place where Winota really suffers as a deck is the price. It's pretty expensive, about a $500 deck in paper. And that's going to include all the land bases, all the special creatures and things, and a lot of the cards go to specifically Winota and not really any other deck. And as far as getting the deck online, it is cheaper, about 300 tickets, but that's still kind of a hefty ask. It's not exactly like you're, buying 5 heroic decks for the same price or anything. But it's still, that is the end of me talking bad on the Winota deck. Everything else about Winota is absolutely fantastic. As far as ease of play, honestly, the Winota deck is a pretty solid S. All you're looking to do is play some dorks that make mana, including Prosperous Innkeeper, resolve a Winota, attack with her friends, and just let her do all the work of putting giant humans into play. She's very, very powerful, and most games really do just come down to resolving a Winota or not. The other routes that you have to victory are just as good. Isika's Chariot, ultra powerful, you get 3 creatures in one thing. You get to play Fable of the Mirror Breaker, that card's kind of absurd in almost every format, Pioneer and I guess below as far as power level goes. And the deck is just the best thing to be doing in the format most of the time. The win rate is also an S. Every single week features at least one Winota top 8 in a Pioneer challenge, and the most recent Pioneer challenge this Sunday was won by a Winota deck. It's ultra powerful, it's not going to stop winning anytime soon. It just got banned out of Explorer for a reason, and well, I think she's kind of here to stay. Even though the price does hold her back, I am still going to put the Winota deck as a deck that is super easy to get into, because it's very easy to play, it wins a ton, and if you can afford it, it's one of the best investments in the entire format. So Winota is going to be our third S tier deck as far as to whether you should get into it or not. So that's going to be my breakdown of the Pioneer format and where I would place each of the decks in Pioneer as far as actually getting into them. So let me know what you think of this list. What are you playing? Is your deck on this list? And do you think that my assessment of getting into your favorite deck is accurate? Let me know. Personally, I think that as a Spirits pilot, my assessment of the Spirits decks, both Bant and Mono Blue, are pretty good. Do you think Blue is super easy to get into? Do you think Bant is a lot harder to get into? Either way, let me know what you think. But as always, if you like what you're watching, make sure to click like on the video and let me know. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done so, and I'll see y'all on the next one.